Someone asked why my video, The March for Science, The Meaning of Political Neutrality, had to be 25 minutes long. Quite simply, it's because the problems that made the March for Science necessary aren't ones that scientists are well prepared to solve. When you move into new territory and try doing things you haven't done before, things get complicated. Our public education system makes up a big part of our national narrative. That leads right back into the incompatibility between the science narrative and the pre-science narrative. Religious narratives have existed for thousands of years because people wanted stories about how the world worked. Scientists have pursued their discoveries with the goal of understanding the world as well as possible. Science only became a narrative when scientists discovered enough reliable information to tell a story of the whole world. The problem is that many religious people don't understand that everyone has a narrative. If you believe that your story of the world is the only real one, that makes everyone else's story of the world seem unimportant. And if you have enough people on your side who agree with you to get what you want, and your group of people has gotten what they want for hundreds of years, you don't need to think about anyone else's stories at all. That brings us to the story that emerges when you put scientific discoveries together. A good education in any subject isn't just a lot of information for people to memorize. A good education creates a framework that the facts fit into. That's a narrative. A good education in science leads to a narrative that many Americans feel is wrong. If this new narrative is wrong, why should we teach it in school? And why should we organize our science classes in a way that makes people learn it? If you don't understand the difference between religion and a narrative, or between your own religion and a narrative, teaching a different narrative in school seems like teaching someone else's religion in school, but not yours. The only way to make the public education system continue to support our traditional Christian-based national narrative is to teach science as a bunch of disconnected facts. By keeping a competing narrative out of the education system, we would be using the education system to keep the traditional narrative intact, meaning the one people learn outside the education system just by growing up in the U.S. surrounded by churches and Christmas and money that says God on it. But that means turning our education system into an obstacle to good science education by limiting teachers to using teaching methods that wouldn't be considered effective in any other subject, but implying this was good science education because it was part of the education system. If good science education leads students to such a limited understanding of science, that implies that scientists must not understand much about the world. We don't use the education system to prevent anyone from getting a good education in science. We need scientists to make the discoveries that our economic growth and national defense depend on in an industrialized society. We just need to use the education system to keep the people who learn good science educations to a low enough level to keep from upsetting our national narrative. The reason it took a 25-minute video to explain the problem instead of a 5-minute video is because we've already picked all the low-hanging fruit. The education system we have has already given a good science education to everyone who's capable of getting a good science education from it. And that number of people isn't a big enough percentage to make science more important to our political system than it has. If we want better public science education, we have to make our education system more effective in communicating ideas. But how do we do that? Do we need to improve the education system quantitatively by investing more money into it and making it better at what it's already doing? Better textbooks and well-paid teachers certainly would help. But would that solve the whole problem? Or do we need to improve the education system qualitatively too, with new approaches to education? The public education system we have now is based on the premise that we need science education to be good enough for people who are good at science to be able to grow up to be scientists, but leave everyone else on their own to believe whatever is most convenient for them. However that plays out in the classrooms of individual teachers, it leads back to that. One obvious way, which a biology teacher told me about recently, is that there are some high schools in the US where they don't teach about evolution in biology class. They only go as far as teaching how systems work. In instructor certification training, you learn that the highest level of learning is called correlation, which means learning to see new connections among things on your own. That depends on learning unifying concepts, which in biology means evolution. Another way you can see this happening is the way science is taught in separate classes. You take the science classes and either pass them or fail them. That's not how you teach a narrative. That's how you teach a skill. The easiest and best way to teach anything is by building up from underlying concepts. Because of the work scientists have done, we now have a set of underlying concepts that connect all the classes in school. I'm not talking here about teaching science as a narrative specifically. I'm talking about teaching all the classes in school as part of the same narrative instead of as individual skills. The unifying concepts that make that narrative possible were discovered by scientists. Another way you can see that science in school is being treated like a job skill instead of a narrative is that you have to be able to do the math to pass the class. If you're trying to train people to be scientists, that makes sense. But if you're trying to teach people to be scientifically literate citizens and voters, that doesn't make sense, because that means that the people who aren't good at math can't learn anything about science. I've known a number of artists who are interested in science but are no good at math, who didn't take any more science classes in high school than they had to, because if they did, they would have failed them, and that would have negatively impacted their applications to college. So they did the best they could in an education system that obviously was designed with someone else in mind, where they could see that information that was being made available to other students wasn't being made available to them. Once again, this is the misunderstanding between science and science philosophy. Science without the math is science philosophy. A narrative is a story that illustrates how philosophical ideas fit together. Science is being taught as a job skill now, and scientists can't figure out why people aren't learning it as a narrative. In science philosophy class, you'd show the students how the math works. Then you'd show them how the philosophical concepts play out in real life with a lot of experiments and other hands-on exercises. Things like writing journals or essays about real-life experiences, group discussions about real-life experience, drawing pictures to illustrate concepts, puzzle solving to figure out ways to deal with concepts, and creating things by using concepts. The cool thing about scientific concepts is that they happen all around us all the time, so they're easy to recognize if you know what clues you're looking for, and once you learn them, they're easy to use. A big problem with making science education more effective is that the public education system is controlled by people who have political goals. Maintaining or upsetting our national narrative will each have political results. Some politicians are very good at taking advantage of opportunities to make political stuff happen. People who want to keep things the way they are usually have an advantage over people who want to change them, because the public is already familiar with the way things are, people already have words for talking about the way things are, and we have social structures in place to make the things that have been happening keep happening. That's one big reason so many men opposed giving women the right to vote for so long, because they already knew how to prevent women from voting. They didn't know what would happen if they allowed women to vote, because they'd never tried it before. As people who believe in good public science education, we need to move past debating if these facts are causally connected and start looking at how they're connected. Even if the only thing you care about in life is good public science education, you believe in the personal empowerment of everyone through informed decision-making. That is a political goal, even if you never thought of it that way. And it conflicts with the goals of some people who have been involved in politics all their lives. Better education depends on a better narrative. A better narrative is one that makes the connections among ideas clearer. That means both conceptually and in real life. An anthropologist friend of mine gave me another good example. Humans have 32 teeth. In medicine, each of them has its own name. And in physical anthropology, each of them has a completely different name. That doesn't seem like a big deal if you assume that the people who take those classes either want to be dentists or anthropologists. How many dentists also want to be anthropologists? Even for the few who do, if you're smart enough to get 2 college degrees, memorizing 32 more vocabulary words shouldn't be hard. But all of that depends on the assumption that the people who take the science classes want careers in science or a closely related field. That isn't education with the public in mind. Think about how this looks from the outside. Is this a sign of people trying to work together? Does this look like experts in related fields working together to develop a coherent body of work? Or is this a sign of people ignoring each other or trying to set themselves apart from each other? If you like learning about teeth so much that you took a class and memorized 32 vocabulary words for them, and then you found out about another class where you could learn more about teeth, but you would have to learn 32 more vocabulary words to refer to things you already had vocabulary words for, would that encourage you or discourage you from taking the class? And would that make you believe that the experts who wrote the books for the classes had read each other's books? If the experts can't even agree on words for what they're talking about, what else do they not agree on? So how much would you really learn by taking their classes? What would happen if anthropologists adopted the medical names for teeth? That would make it easier for people to learn about teeth. Would that lead to anything important? Maybe not, but we don't actually know because scientists have never tried this experiment before. Would we lose something valuable if we did this? Maybe, but even if we did, we would probably gain something even more valuable. As people have discovered throughout history, societies get better in general when people get better educations and better understand the world around them. That is, after all, the whole reason science and public schools were invented in the first place. The people who are easy to educate with the approach to science education that we're using are already being educated by it. That also means that people who have degrees in science now are the people who graduated from the education system we have now. That means that qualitative improvement in science education is going to depend on input from people who don't have degrees in science. Some of those people are going to talk about problems that none of the experts have noticed before or that they assume aren't important. Some of the claims they make for improvements that are needed are going to be hard for some scientists to accept. This leads right back to the problem of people assuming that scientists know the most about science and then confusing science with everything related to science. People who have degrees and careers in science are seen as successful at science. But that also means that everyone who has a degree in science right now got their degree from an education system that only worked well enough to get Donald Trump elected president. All of the people who are recognized as experts in science right now got their science degrees from an education system that we can reasonably say now has failed us. If you're a scientist, no matter how good you are at science, the education system that got you to where you are isn't good enough to educate the public enough to give you the support you need. Whenever anyone tries to change anything in a society, they run into this basic problem, including Galileo attempting to convince people that the moon had craters on it. If all the symbols of expertise in a field are given to people who learned one way of thinking, you've ruled out the possibility that people who disagree with that way of thinking could have points of view that are equally or more important to those of the experts. When you're recognized as an expert at something and someone else isn't, and you have a disagreement with them, it's easy to use the argument from authority to convince people that the other person is wrong. So remember to look at the evidence. Who won the presidential election in 2016? That's what our public education system led to. That's why we need qualitative improvement in public science education, not just the quantitative improvement that better funding would lead to. I've got a lot more to say about how to turn education into an interconnected story of life. So subscribe to my channel if you haven't already and stay tuned for more videos.